Hello, everyone. My name is Monica Lewis. I am the engagement manager at SMU DataArts. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to provide my physical description. I'm an African American woman in my mid 30s. I am wearing a gray blouse with a green outer sweater. My hair is pulled back, and I have clear rimmed glasses with a white background. I am hosting today's session from the traditional lands of the Sana and the Kol Alwikan on traditional lands that is now known as Houston. On behalf of our team at SMU Data Arts and our amazing and esteemed guests, we sincerely thank you for joining today's presentation as we explore national insights with a conversation on operating and financial health trends for arts and cultural organizations. Before I introduce everyone, I want to provide some quick housekeeping details since we will have a very large group that we're very excited to engage. So, first, I do want to preface that we are recording today's webinar and we will share a recording for all that registered or who were on our wait list. And I'll even share that our resources for that follow up will be very healthy as we have a lot to cover today. Quickly, as you can see in your screen, there are some helpful Zoom features that will allow you to share and engage with us during our conversation. And the first one that you'll notice is the Q&A option. You're welcome to share any questions that you have about today's content, and you can do that at any time or any portion of our presentation today. Again, I'll note that we have a large group of folks who will be joining us today, and it's quite possible that we may not get to every single question, and that's okay. We do have an amazing team in the background that's going to help and support and answer the questions as best as we can. You also have the chat feature available to you, and you're able to respond to our chat responses and chat questions that we'll host for you. And you can also share any general comments or feedback. This can also be a great space for peer-to-peer learning. So if you see a question and you have some insights to share, feel free to use that chat for an extension of the conversation. If you have any technology issues, that chat feature will be another way to communicate with our team in the background. So feel free to utilize that space as well. I do want to share a few community norms. We do ask that you keep your comments respectful, treat others with respect and dignity. Defamatory, abusive, profane, or threatening language will not be tolerated in this webinar space. We encourage you to be kind to each other. Folks are coming from different perspectives and walks of life in this moment, so we hope that you amplify kindness in our webinar space. And please note that your chat, when you do post to everyone, everyone will be allowed to see that content. So use caution when you're sharing proprietary information and be thoughtful when you post, as those things can be visible to all that attend. And if you progress forward, Zani, for me, we do have closed captioning available for you. You can find that closed captioning option on their Zoom dashboard by clicking that CC icon. You can see subtitle settings. You can make adjustments, making the font size larger or smaller. And again, if you need any assistance with these features, someone on our team will be happy to assist you. Now, our schedule for today is pretty packed, so I want to run through this really quickly. We're going to start by looking at some data on the top, but our conversation will be held by our esteemed guests. And I want to share with you a little bit about who those folks are. So allow me to introduce Jill Robinson, who is the driving force in the arts and culture sector, who has inspired leaders and organizations for more than 3 decades. She is the CEO and owner of TRG Arts, a renowned international data-driven change agency. Jill's expertise and counsel are sought out by art and cultural executives worldwide. She believes in the transformational power of arts and cultural experience and the positive, profound change in the business model of arts organizations. And it leads to artistic innovation that can inspire entire communities. Welcome, Jill. We're also joined by Ted Russell. Ted serves as a nonprofit arts management consultant, strategist, and facilitator. He joins this conversation with over 30 years of experience launching and scaling initiatives, building the capacity of organizations, and helping artists and creative workers thrive. His work focuses on art advocacy, research, strategic planning, and coaching. He is one of our fellows at SMU DataArts, where he serves as an intellectual partner on the critical issues prevailing in the arts and cultural field. Thank you so much, Ted, for joining us. And last but absolutely not least, we have Rebecca Thomas. Rebecca is the founder and principal of the Rebecca Thomas and Associates organization. RTA helps nonprofits and their supporters balance their societal aspirations with business realities. She assists nonprofit leaders in making choices that build organizational health and adaptability. She also collaborates with philanthropies to design and implement grant strategies and programs that better align with resources to organizational needs. Rebecca joins our conversation with 2 decades of consulting experience and field tested perspectives about what it takes to build resilient institutions in service of their missions. Again, welcome, Jill, Ted, and Rebecca. I'm so excited to hear from you, but I will transition to Zannie, who is going to lead us through a updated look at national trends. And Zannie is the director of SMU DataArts, the National Center for Arts Research, and a professor at arts management at SMU's Meadows School of Arts and Cox School of Business. She has served as a consultant to numerous grant-making organizations and art organizations across the country. She has published articles that examine strategic factors that influence organizational performance in leading academic journals and marketing. Zannie, I'm so excited to learn from you. We leave it up to you to teach us.
Thank you so much, Monica. And thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. What an amazing tapestry of folks here from across the country. It's really great to be with you all. And it's an honor, of course, to share the conversation with our amazing colleagues, Jill, Rebecca, and Ted. I'm going to provide a brief visual description. I'm a mixed race woman in my very, very late 50s who uses she and her pronouns. I've got black shoulder length hair. I'm in a largely white room and I'm wearing a gray sleeveless top. Today, we're here to talk about trends, and this is kind of a spoiler alert that overall there was an uptick in a number of financial and operating trends in 2023. Nevertheless, the full recovery is still in process. This look in the rearview mirror really provides context for some of the underlying challenges that I know a lot of organizations are still facing today. So we're going to kind of do a brief introduction of what data we're looking at, talk about earned revenue, contributed revenue, bottom line and working capital, and then we're going to talk. So I'm going to dive right in here. The data that we're looking at is for 734 organizations whose budgets range in size from $900 up to $117 million in 2023. The average budget was $2.5 million. And you can see that the average is actually skewed by some large organizations, and that's evidenced by the fact that the median or the midpoint in the range shows that half of all organizations had a budget under $468,000. All our organizations that submit data to a funder or to a national service organization through the cultural data profile. So a huge thank you to all organizations whose time and whose effort is reflected and invested in these findings. Reflected in the trends, 56% are small organizations. Small, we are calling organizations with a budget under $500,000. 17% are medium, between $500,000 and $1 million. And 27% are large, with a budget of more than $1 million. And if you take these organizations compared to the universe of nonprofit arts organizations as a whole, we are 21% fewer small organizations than the universe, 8% more medium organizations, and 13% more large organizations. So it's skewed a little bit large. Throughout the presentation, you'll note that I take inflation into account. We do that since what cost $1 at the end of 2019 cost $1.19 at the end of 2023. And that's a big issue, as you all know. Of these organizations, 11% self-identify as being of, by, or for Black, Indigenous, or people of color community or tradition, and 89% do not. The average non-BIPOC budgets organization's budget was about 3.4 times the size of the average BIPOC organization's budget back in 2019. And as you can see here, just shy of 3 times larger in 2023. So, however, there was actually far less distance if we were to look at the median. 408,000 for BIPOC, 471,000 for non-BIPOC. And that tells us that the groups were mostly similar in terms of budget size, but there were more large, very large non-BIPOC organizations at the upper end skewing that average. So it tells us that on average, although the gap in budget size is close somewhat, they had neither the same starting place nor the same ending place. So, any notion of actually achieving a level playing field now for the ecology as a whole still isn't a reality. And before I start jumping into trends, Monica, can we take a quick second for a poll?
Absolutely. I would love to activate our poll. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And you're going to see three questions. One is just going to ask who's in the room. So if you could select the option that best identifies your organization, and then you're going to find two additional questions. We're interested to know if your organization identifies as an organization that's BIPOC or has a BIPOC community that it serves. And what did your earned revenue look like compared to before the pandemic and now? So we're going to give folks a few minutes to provide their feedback, and we've got a diverse group of people in this room. I can tell you that, Sonny.
Thanks, Monica. While folks are responding, I'm going to move on and start with earned revenue. These are earned revenue trends. Earned revenue has recovered, but not fully. So the darker shadow in the columns shows actual dollar levels, and the blue accounts for inflation and adjustments to give us a sense of how far a dollar went for organizations each year relative to 2019. It's rebounded substantially, but it was still 12% lower in 2023 than 2019 after adjusting for inflation for the average organization in this study. It's interesting to note that the BIPOC and non-BIPOC organization trends went in different directions. BIPOC organizations' average earned revenue growth exceeded inflation by 3%, whereas non-BIPOC organizations' earned revenue fell 12% shy of inflation. Digging even further, we found that the real earned revenue growth was the case for half of the BIPOC organizations, proportionally more than the 31% of non-BIPOC organizations for whom this was the case. Monica, do we have full results in yet from folks with us here today, or should I go on one more slide?
I think we have enough feedback to be able to share what folks are saying.
Okay.
I'll share that most of our organizations, or most of the folks here are representing arts organizations, 69% of our audience today. And it looks like when answering the question, does your organization identify? We had 20% say that they didn't, that they do. And of those, most of them said no. If their organization identified it as BIPOC or BIPOC serving, did they have much higher levels of earned revenue after the pandemic than before? That was our content so far.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for sharing that feedback. I'm going to go on and dig a little bit deeper into ticket and admissions and member revenue. It's an important share of total earned revenue for the average organization in normal times, so it's a good place to start. Here we see that attendance, ticket revenue, and prices were lower over time. In-person attendance kind of shown on the right, and the admissions generated revenue shown in the chart on the left. Overall, naturally slowed to a trickle during the pandemic-related closures. Organizations' high and low average single ticket prices were lower over time, taking inflation into account. A majority of groups of every kind saw double-digit attendance declines, with BIPOC organizations faring a little bit better. More than a third of the BIPOC organizations reported attendance growth, whereas this was the case for slightly less than a third of the non-BIPOC groups. Single ticket admissions and revenue bounced back in 2022, as you see again in 2023, 10% higher in absolute dollars over time and only 8% shy of its pre-pandemic levels in real dollars. And this trend was pretty stable for organizations of every size. Again, for BIPOC organizations, they kind of bucked the trend with growth in single ticket and admissions revenue. They outpaced inflation by 7%, which kind of was pushing that earned revenue growth that I talked about in the last slide. These early signs about subscription and membership revenue, it may be an area that's permanently scarred, and I know Jill's going to want to speak to this when we talk in a little bit. These inflation-adjusted declines in this area were just north of 60%, regardless of organizational size or what kind of mission it has. Now, we know that COVID was a major factor in attendance drop-offs, but in many ways, it intensified declines in the trends that existed pre-pandemic for subscribers. Over the past 20 years, we know that theater subscription sales were at their highest point back in 2005, and they declined precipitously during the Great Recession and continued their downward slide thereafter. So yes, we're looking at a short period of time here, but this is an ongoing trend. Let's look beyond admissions. Earn revenue by source. So organizations earn revenue, as we know, from diverse activities. So just wanted to give a glimpse of showing in 2023 how it changed based on organizational size. Education program revenue, which is shaded in the dark blue, it was as big of a slice of the earned revenue pie as ticket sales, the light blue and the red slices, for small and medium organizations. Revenue from contracts and tours, the yellow slice, it played an increasingly important role as budget size just decreased. So organizations earn revenue, as we know, from a set of diverse activities. Let's turn to contributed support. So here we're looking at primary, private, and public support trends by source. Exceptional federal government support drove an overall 6% rise in contributed revenue. And here we're looking by source. And you'll see that the percentages to the right reflect inflation. If we were to ignore inflation, the story for individual giving would be individual philanthropy, would be that giving maintained kind of fairly steady state in absolute dollars. It was 5% higher if we looked only in real dollars, but when we adjust for inflation, it was actually 12% lower. So unfortunately, inflation is real. So if a donor simply renews at the same dollar level year after year, they may not think about the fact that those dollars are going far less over time. Among individual donors, it's kind of interesting to note that the subset that are trustees, their giving was at a 5-year low in 2023 for organizations of every size. Among private donors, only foundations increased support in real dollars. Growth in foundation giving actually was the average experience for organizations of every size. An average increase of 27% for small organizations, 16% for medium, 30% for large. Foundation support growth exceeded inflation for roughly half of the organizations in each of the 3 size categories. Federal relief programs kept many organizations afloat during the pandemic, saved jobs in the arts, fulfilling the intended purpose of many of the relief funds. Now, it used to be the case that local funding was always greater than state funding on average, which was greater than federal funding on average. Each year since 2021, federal funding has been at the highest for the average organization, higher than even local funding. So some of the trends are fairly consistent regardless of organizational size to varying degrees of magnitude. The trend pattern that you see here in the chart for government funding was the case for federal funding for organizations of every size and ilk. All organizations saw a doubling of state support over time, even after adjusting for inflation. In 2023, state and local agencies had exceptional federal relief funds to re-grant. Small organizations saw the biggest percentage increases in local funding. Large organizations, and especially performing arts organizations, were the biggest beneficiaries of exceptional federal government support from programs like the Small Business Administration's Payroll Protection Program and the Shuttered Venue Operating Grants. Federal dollars for large organizations supported only 1% of expenses back in 2019, but 10% in 2021, 13% in 2022, and back down to 4% in 2023, again, compared to budget. Let's look more closely at differences for BIPOC and non-BIPOC organizations. So institutional support for BIPOC groups grew, but individual support fell at a much higher rate than for their non-BIPOC peers. For non-BIPOC organizations, foundation giving, the kind of green line in the charts, was nearly a quarter higher in real dollars over time. For the BIPOC organizations, it rose 76% higher than inflation. Some highlights to share. Every year since 2021, BIPOC organizations averaged higher annual foundation support than non-BIPOC organizations, despite having budgets that averaged 30 to 40% lower than the average budget size of a non-BIPOC organization, depending on the year. Foundation support exceeded inflation for 69%, so more than 2/3 of BIPOC organizations. and for 47% of non-BIPOC organizations. So although the percentage increase for government for BIPOC orgs, 285%, 108% for non-BIPOC organizations, they still, when you look at the 2023 dollar figures, averaged a fraction of the dollars received by their non-BIPOC peers, which I think is really interesting. So here's a bit more story. For BIPOC organizations, local funding was higher in 2019, whereas non-BIPOC organizations, it was only 17% higher. By contrast, non-BIPOC organizations saw a six-fold increase in federal dollars, whereas BIPOC organizations' federal funding was up fourfold. So it's really important to acknowledge that they had very different starting places and very different ending places, both in individual giving and in terms of government support. Let's turn now to bottom line. Here you see the dollars spent and reported by organizations each year before inflation. And I wanted to share revenue alongside expenses because it really drives home the fact that organizations did a remarkable job of operating within their means throughout the COVID crisis. The average organization cut total expenses during the pandemic, have added back expenses and operating revenue, of course, since then. Revenue was 16% higher in absolute dollars. Expenses were 14% higher in 2023 than 2019. But because every dollar had less buying power over time, adjusting for inflation, operating revenue was 3% lower over time, while expenses were still down by 4%. Now you can see in there's a line of blue across the top of the charts, and this is the level of surplus and deficit as a percentage of expenses. You can see that bottom lines were boosted in 21 and 22 as doors were closed and relief funds were flowing in. BIPOC organizations grew expenses by 20% above inflation, whereas for BIPOC organizations, expenses were 5% less over time. BIPOC organizations also grew operating revenues 36%. The net effect for BIPOC organizations was that they went from averaging deficits in 2019 and 2020 to averaging surpluses every year ever since then. Now, this minimal 1% deficit in 2023, it may be an anomaly, or maybe it's the canary in the coal mine of what's going to be the future if a revenue engine doesn't emerge that's sustainable and can keep pace with inflation. Inflation for the roughly half of organizations that did not see a surge in foundation funding. Realistically, we're returning to pre-pandemic trends where expenses regularly exceeded revenues, producing deficits for over 25% of the field. Those deficits are growing overall, and this is true regardless of organization size. When we break it down by size, so we're looking at median and then the top 25% and top 75 percentiles. So roughly for small, medium, and large organizations, the red trend line is kind of half of organizations, and half of organizations in every category roughly broke even, although the trajectory headed downward for organizations of every size. The top 25%, the gray dotted line, managed to gain a little more, whereas the bottom 25%, noted in blue, dipped to deeper deficits. So the gap between profitable and unprofitable grew at every budget size. And I know Rebecca and Ted want to be able to address these issues in just a little bit. If we look for BIPOC and non-BIPOC organizations, similar exercise, we see that a quarter of the non-BIPOC organizations saw increasingly large profit margins. It's likely that these organizations benefited from some of the exceptional initiatives like the Mackenzie Scott Philanthropy and the Ford Foundation's American Cultural Treasures Program, the numerous regional treasures programs that were fostered around the country. Non-BIPOC organizations did worse over time across the board. So this is really kind of a critical juncture of looking at where change is happening and for whom, what kind of change. Lastly, let's look at that really sexy topic of working capital. If your organization has ever been cash strapped, you know exactly what we're talking about with working capital. Few arts leaders ever wake up with excitement about it. A lot of people lose sleep over it. So it's a measure of liquidity that represents unrestricted resources available to meet day-to-day access to readily available cash. And we measure it by unrestricted current assets minus current liabilities. So let's see what the trends were. I want to take a step back to 2019 because this was really a Goldilocks economy pre-pandemic. Heading into the pandemic, these organizations averaged working capital of 6 months worth of total expenses. So this is skewed by some large organizations. If we look instead at the median or the experience of at least half of the organizations, they had 3.9 months of working capital heading into the pandemic. Let's look at distribution of working capital over time for the bookended years, 2019 and 2023. Here you're seeing the percentage of organizations that fell into each of these categories. And while fewer groups had little to no liquidity in 2023 than in 2019, the kind of the charts on the bar charts on the end of the spectrum here, the gains seen in 2021 are quickly eroding. At fiscal year 2023, more than 45% of organizations recorded over 6 months of working capital. However, the bottom two columns on the left, over 23% remain quite weak, with only 2 months, less than 2 months of working capital. If we look at BIPOC and non-BIPOC organizations, we see that BIPOC organizations during 2019 overall tended to end their fiscal years with a slight deficit. As we saw earlier, BIPOC groups, who are the dark columns here, they tended to be financially more resilient than their non-BIPOC peers, the lighter columns. For non-BIPOC organizations, median working capital was up 135% over time, whereas that of non-BIPOC organizations was up 88% over time. BIPOC organizations received less of the revenue pie. We saw what that looked like in terms of comparison with contributed revenue, for example. So they're more likely to stay small, which means that they can be more nimble. But exclusion from equitable access to revenue and capital means that many of the BIPOC groups who want to grow don't have the agency to do so. So BIPOC organizations are often under-resourced in a broader sense, even when their financials may show that they have more cash. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share because with my fellow panelists, let's talk. I want to ask each of you to talk about what are the findings that resonate most for you? And please bring new insights into the conversations given your own work. Rebecca, will you get us started? What did the trends say to you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Zannie. As I consider all of this wonderfully detailed data, I think two major takeaways stand out for me, right? The first is that the recovery in the arts remains quite tenuous. And the second is that financial improvements since pre-pandemic times has been concentrated among only about a quarter of organizations in the sector. So the field is really on average surviving on the tail end of extraordinary institutional giving, which still does sit on balance sheets, but the sector can't build its future on this now fleeting form of giving. I'm encouraged to see some flickers of hope in the data. Sector-wide earned revenue at least is nominally back to pre-pandemic levels. Contributed revenue is still strong, even if it's off of its peak. But when I look at all of the forms of what I would consider to be relatively reliable streams of revenue that comes from those typically recurring sources, such as program earnings, ticket sales, attendance, as well as individual and trustee giving. All of those relatively reliable revenue streams are down on an inflation-adjusted basis from 2019. And that's especially problematic now because expenses are again outpacing operating revenue for a majority of groups in the field. And we're sort of back at the place that we were pre-pandemic, where at least half the sector, right, is running small recurring deficits. I also add, I think that what I see in this data is a growing bifurcation between well-resourced and really struggling organizations. And we see that very much in our practice right now as well, that the recovery has been uneven, that embedded in this sort of overall story of somewhat tepid reemergence is also a story of haves versus have-nots, right? As you showed in the percentile data, across every size range, deficits are gaping and growing into the double digits for 25% of the sector. And so as we think about what does all this mean for the future, right, I would argue that this is a moment that organizations, it's really calling on cultural organizations to change, to lean into change. I think that business as usual is simply unsustainable for many cultural groups, if not the majority of the sector right now. And that this is a moment when it would be beneficial for organizations to take a step back and to really thoughtfully examine how they can advance their mission and strengthen their financial resiliency, even if they have to change certain aspects of their institution. And maybe just the last thing I'll say here is that while there's no recipe for change, there's no sort of cookie cutter model we can all look to, that I can say with some confidence that the scale of change that will be required of any individual organization is a balance sheet question. So if you're an organization here today with healthy liquidity, 5, 6, 7 months of cash on hand, you can afford to take more risks. You can afford to take the time to implement shifts. Maybe you can absorb a modest deficit for a year or two as you reposition yourself. But if you're here today with a few months, days, or weeks of working capital on hand, if your budget is pointing to those growing deficits, there's an urgency to make some transformational choices quickly. And that might mean giving yourself permission, at least to consider what it means to be smaller. It might also mean exploring whether anyone in your donor universe can be compelled to support you with some capital that's dedicated to this change so that you have the breathing room to adapt.
Rebecca, thank you so much. Jill, thinking about the necessity for transformational change at this moment of time, you work so deeply with organization leaders, and you have this keen perspective on the directions and the areas that they need to consider investing in. What's top of mind for you related to the findings and related to Rebecca's comments?
Zannie, building on my colleague Rebecca, whose comments, boy, resonate, and the data that you shared resonates so much. Rebecca pointed to the categories of income that are more recurring: programming income, philanthropic income, and yet. Some of you in this room know, my colleagues here certainly do, that in partnership with SMU DataArts, TRG ingests data from mostly medium and large sized organizations who have the capacity through their CRM and point of sale systems to dialogue with our technology. So I want to acknowledge the data set that we have comes from medium and larger size institutions, but there's a lot of it. And in that data, there's almost 500 million arts and cultural transactions from around the globe that we pull the hood back on. And when we look at the resiliency over the next 3 to 5 years, and I dare say that the next 3 to 5 years are bound to have headwinds or continued changes and disruption. I'm not sure we're quite done yet. So this obsession that Rebecca was describing around working capital, Zannie, that you defined beautifully for us, we have a real sense of focus and priority on within our consulting practice and within when we look at the data that I described. And in that data, within those revenue streams, programmatic income, philanthropic income, the truth, the pre-pandemic truth that we over-prospect and under-retain, this notion that those revenues are recurring is an assumption that just doesn't show in the data. So today, almost 50% of databases are comprised of brand new audiences. We've lost some. Many have changed their habits and behavior. They've moved. There's a variety of reasons, but nearly half of databases today are new patrons who are delivering only 40% of income. And those new patrons' churn rates are greater by 10 points than they were prior to the pandemic. The proportion of patrons, I'll share one tile with you, the proportion of patrons who are buying who have the most frequency in any given seasonal cycle has declined since the pandemic. And as a result, what is made up, what's in our databases today are people who are less frequently and who are less frequent and don't renew at the same rate. So there is a lot of challenge in consumer behavior today that I and we are concerned about and trying to draw attention to how we can focus on actually creating recurring revenues out of these relationships, recurring, sustainable, resilient relationships that can fuel and sustain us in the next 3 to 5 years. I will say there are bright spots. Our team did a webinar, I'll wrap up with this. Our team did a webinar today about the power of frequency and the power of investing in frequency. And what we're seeing is that in the 23-24 traditional subscription season, and I just want to remind everyone that the subscription is a marketing tactic. It's not a moral obligation. It's a marketing tactic. A membership is a recurring revenue program. A frequent buyer program is a recurring revenue program. A points program can be a recurring revenue program, as can philanthropic programs. But we're seeing recovery within our benchmark for the first time in subscription units and income in the 23-24 season compared to pre-pandemic times. Investment and revenue management are the drivers for it. So as we continue our discussion today, prioritizing and investing in developing those recurring revenues are key from our point of view regarding resiliency.
Thank you, Jill. So we've had this intensive look at, okay, let's think about the health of balance sheet and where things are going with respect to earned revenue and to purchasing power in relationship to communities. Ted, you've got a great vantage point on the systems that support and surround the organizations. What are some of your thoughts and reactions?
Thanks, Zannie. Yeah, it's really interesting with the perspective I have. I'm a consultant now with my own firm, and you see my California for the Arts background because I'm working with the incredible team on an artist advocacy program. So just to let people know, but my foundation hat is one that I wore for almost 20 years for two different foundations in the state of California. And before that, I did lots of arts marketing. And Jill, you're almost pulling me to pull back on my marketing hat, but I think you're covering the points so well. I do think investing in frequency is so important, and people need to look at the earned revenue mix because, one of the things that stood out for me is that earned revenue is just not going to catch up to the increase in expenses for most groups. And we saw that overall how it fell 12% short of inflation. We recognize in different communities, your actual cost increases may be greater than that, the overall inflation rate. So that part is really, really tough. On the institutional side, I do want to talk about foundation funding. As a person who is a recovering funder, I am actually really impressed and proud of those increases of 28% when adjusted for inflation. We obviously saw some needs for the arts community that were driven by the pandemic, and a lot of funders responded to that. We also have increased funding for BIPOC organizations. Funders, I'm glad to see the percentage of you that are in the room right now. Let's sustain the support for BIPOC organizations. For those who get confused, like we're talking about balancing a field that supported the growth of only one leg for so many years. And that would look odd if you were not just a bodybuilder, but a field. So BIPOC organizations have been undercapitalized by funders for so long. This balancing the field is really crucial. And Rebecca, I was glad you highlighted the need for change capital. I did want to highlight some of the resources that you've developed over the years, Rebecca, and maybe we can share the links because it's so important to think about the different type of capital needs that organizations have at different points in time. And I think so many organizations out there absolutely have to reimagine themselves. Our society has completely changed over the course of the past 4 or 5 years. And I think a lot of organizations in our field still are working with their 20th century missions and need to adapt. And then briefly on government funding, it's a good news story, tough news story. The funding during the pandemic was amazing. I want everyone to remember that a lot of that was the result of extraordinary advocacy efforts, extraordinary efforts that we may need to normalize for the sake of the field. And that government funding led to increases in net assets and working capital. The government funding is disappearing, especially the pandemic-driven funding was there as a stopgap measure. So that's pretty much gone now. And local arts agencies have a lot of pressures from shrinking city budgets. That's especially true here in California, but I know it's true for a lot of regions. And the state funding, what we've seen is how political that can be for state councils and agencies. Here in California, once again, the advocacy efforts of hundreds of people, if not thousands, actually helped us recover 75% of the proposed cuts for the California Arts Council that were slated in the state's budget for this year, and 75% of what the cut had been, which was disproportional to other agencies, was recovered. So once again, I'm going to keep highlighting the importance of advocacy, but government funders, I really understand what so much of you are up against and how hard you work for the community. So it's up to all of us to advocate not just for the arts agencies, but other departments and agencies that can support arts and culture organizations and the work that we're doing in communities. I'll stop there and we'll talk more about some of what I can imagine, but I just wanted to share my responses across those categories.
Thank you, Ted. It's great to have you. I know that we talk so frequently about these issues, but to hear from such deep expertise from each of your vantage points is so enlightening for me. I'm curious, do you have questions for or responses to one another based on what you've heard from your peers here? I think about issues around, we've talked a lot about attendance, and we've also talked about, working capital or higher working capital level just going to stay the new reality? Is it sustainable? What do you think we're going to see in 2024? What are some of your thoughts based on what you're seeing about where organizations are headed?
I was really grooving on the conversation about change that both Ted and Rebecca are highlighting. Transformative change. I'm grappling a lot right now, both of you, all of you, with the polarity between the nonprofit and charity-oriented mindset that we have had and the business mindset that is required also to make decisions that will help us be sustainable in the next 3 to 5. And arts and cultural organizations work in so many different ways and have so many different stakeholders, and there's so many different pressures to respond. And I'm curious how Ted and Rebecca, what you see, but I see a real need to identify the revenues that will sustain and focus energy and attention and disciplines in those areas. And it's really hard to do. It requires leadership, and sometimes it requires difficult change.
And it requires investment, right? I mean, I think when I talk about this concept of change capital, we're not just talking about money to change in any which way, right? We're talking about money to really invest, as we would in the for-profit sector, into new revenue generating strategies for the future. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach here. But the idea of having multi-year flexible capital to experiment with and implement capacity building strategies, revenue raising strategies, revenue retaining strategies that over time lead to a more sustainable place. It's critical, and it's the type of money that's been missing from the nonprofit sector for way too long. There are donors. We work with many of them who are sort of stepping into the waters a little bit, if you will, here, and have experimented over time with this kind of money, but it's still very much on the margins.
Yeah, Jill, I think it's such a challenging time. And I saw someone in the chat asked, we talked about having a sobering conversation today for many folks who have just been toiling away. And I was once managing director of a small modern dance company, and I was on the phone trying to delay payments and doing that hard work when you're short. And I do think being really realistic, I'm not as deep in marketing these days, but someone asked about if we see theater audiences returning, and I don't think we'll get back to pre-pandemic levels, but which audiences might you be able to attract that will be greater than they were pre-pandemic? Individual audiences and communities that may be tied to you by topic, maybe ethically, maybe based on location. And for groups that actually have, I almost called it a war chest just now, but I'm trying to change my metaphor. So if you have a peace chest that's large enough and you can focus on change, it's really essential. We've seen organizations in the Bay Area in crisis. I'll just briefly mention even the San Francisco Ballet, a larger institution, but really struggling financially and with audiences that did what you said, Rebecca. They worked hard to realign their finances so they could build the runway to do some successful experimentation. And an old fuddy-duddy group, and if you're in the audience, I mean it in the best way, an old fuddy-duddy group like San Francisco Ballet, which does incredible contemporary modern ballet, as well as all those chestnut classics, were able to imagine a very new program to help them attract young audiences, including fashion, music, all these other things. And that was because they had the change capital to work with once they got really skinny with plans for cutting costs and increasing revenue. And the other thing, once again, I'll just call to the funders for some of the groups that have really strong missions, have not just historic value in your communities, but are really relevant today with the work they're doing. And they may even be serving traditionally underserved communities, and they have smart management. Maybe you can be the source of their change capital, because our regular grants aren't going to be enough right now. And that's even if you're one of the percentage of funders that are offering general operating support, but specifically designating capital for change. Some of the experimentation needs to be subsidized, whether a group has a peace chest or whether they're really tight on working capital, but they're committed to change. So I'll just tie those two things in with my fellow panelists.
I want to make sure that we can continue the conversation, and maybe this will be a spark for another thread. What are some top 2 or 3 either questions that you think that arts leaders should consider consider for themselves, for their organizations at this point of time, or do you have some specific recommendations that you can offer to arts leaders? Ted, why don't you go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just keep rolling. And I recognize that what we're talking about moving forward, there's not one silver bullet across arts and culture. There's not just one easy solution. If we had that, we would have sent it out before the webinar. No needs the whole. But looking at the philanthropic community and how they're responding to changes, I do think there's some important things happening. I think we have to talk about the significant pandemic relief that was directed to artists, culture bearers, organizations, but recognize that varied by community across the country. I think the equity response to racial reckoning is really essential. That cannot stop. Really important to continue rebalancing things. But, I do feel that I want to call all our funders in the room to go even deeper. I feel like funders have individualized responses. Some have relationships with organizations where at least folks are calling when they have the existential crisis. I don't mean putting on existential theater on stage. I mean, the organization is, in peril. And some funders are supporting financial literacy training. There's a great effort that's coming together in the San Francisco Bay Area through the Northern California Grantmakers Arts Loan Fund. But once again, financial literacy training and management isn't evenly distributed. Some funders are convening the field. I think more of that should happen, and funders connecting with other funders to collaborate on this is great. I'm not hearing about bailouts, but I think organizations that are important enough funders can be a small part of that. It's really about communities that have saved organizations on the brink. I still feel like the most important thing that we can talk about right now for all the organizations here is reliable revenue. Even though the individual donors have decreased over time, there's got to be pockets that you can do. And it's about what are you doing that's important in your community? You know, it's not just why the work is crucial to you, to us, because art's changed our lives, but you know, when folks are so busy as individual donors and a lot of the world feels like in some crisis, what do we do with the fraction of their attention we have, and how are we important to a community? I can look like at a longtime grantee like we have here near me, the Oakland Museum, which I helped support through the Irvine Foundation, a great program they had with Friday nights and bringing people into the community. And yes, some go into the galleries, but just having food trucks and a happy hour and entertainment and potential for dancing made that museum so much more relevant to more members of the community in a sustainable way versus just the fact that every grade school student went there at some point, but that's not enough. So how can you be more important to your community? I look at climate change issues and a lot of folks in our field are like, well, what can we do about that? Well, geez, if you want to be important to your community, figure out how you elevate the issues, how you do work that's related to it, how you change your organizations. We actually had one of the first solar-powered net zero theaters that's just a few blocks from me, Shotgun Players, that had an amazing campaign, and they're able to be sustainable, and that was a whole different set of resources for them. So I'll stop there. There's so much that folks need to do, but we are very creative people, and I think we have to lean into that right now. It's not just about keeping our shoulder to the wheel.
Ted, thank you. And thank you for also giving some examples. I know there was a question that had come up about, can we give examples of some bold change? And, you know, clearly you've had some experience with that. So thank you for sharing it. Jill, recommendations.
I love building on Ted in this moment, because the question about risk and how we manage risk at the time, at this time right now, is the thing, and identifying where the risk is and where the potential reward is in revenue streams and in investment is where we're seeing successful organizations grow these recurring revenue streams. So I would say getting clear about revenue priorities within your business model. And for some, that's going to mean school systems. For others, that's going to mean programs on stage. But getting clear about that, getting clear about not doing everything. We're going to have to stop doing everything. And that is hard for us to do in arts and culture. You who run these arts and cultural businesses have lots of stakeholders, lots of relationships to satisfy. And in the near term, getting focused feels key. Investing, if customer revenues, what I call customer revenues, ticket buyers, members, donors, if those revenue streams are fueling your organization today and can and should be in the next, or can be in the next 3 to 5 years, investing there is required. And I would go so far as to say getting obsessed about those activities and those relationships, and then getting real, to Ted's point, about what it is you're doing in your community and the way that your customers are experiencing it. That's as practical as your website and your mobile app, and what the experience is that you're asking people in your community to have, or inviting them to consider. There's a lot of testing and learning happening right now in the field, not just in frequency programs like membership alongside subscription, alongside frequent buyer points, but also in where the activities are happening, what the environment is that I'm experiencing arts and culture. And with capital, of course, we can do more of that, but with focusing resources and attention and not trying to do everything, we can also take small steps in creating a flywheel that can sustain us moving forward. I have leave behinds that have case studies that will tell some of these stories, and And thank you for the invitation to participate today.
Thank you so much, Jill. Rebecca, last but
Okay.
certainly not least.
All right, let me see if I can identify a couple of additional suggestions. Maybe we'll depart from revenue and talk a little bit very briefly about infrastructure, people, and balance sheets. First, I would say, as you consider what change means for your institution, prioritize flexibility in your programming, your staffing structure, and your administrative backbone. You want to be able to stay nimble right now. Strengthen your foundation, your existing infrastructure capacity before pursuing future growth, before taking on another facility expansion project. The data tells us that as organizations increase their fixity of costs and assets, as they grow their programs and their square footage too quickly, without the resources to support their growth, that they weaken financially. I think right now it's really important to balance human capital alongside financial capital. Right? We're talking a lot about financial strength today, but we don't want to prioritize the accumulation of cash at the expense of paying staff and artists a living wage. During the pandemic, many of you, I am assuming, rightly addressed the historical underinvestment in your people. Having said that, some of the staff structures that made sense pre-pandemic may not make sense anymore. And so I think as a field, we're grappling with both how to pay people equitably and how to right size, adjust staffing models to the programming that audiences desire and will pay for. And then maybe finally, since I spend so much of my waking hours talking about balance sheets and how they lend stability for risk management and risk taking, I'll say that it's just very important as you recover, as you change, as you move into the future, that you prioritize your financial asset building in the right order, right? Starting with that precious working capital for everyday management. And then once that's in place, setting surplus goals and special fundraising targets that contribute to reserve building over time. Right? This is not the time to prioritize, right, endowments. It's the time to prioritize liquidity and flexibility as you focus on audience development, revenue building, and fiscal health.
Ooh, I know that you have all left our participants with lots and lots to chew on. Ted, Jill, Rebecca, thank you so much. Every time I spend time with you, I learn. I'm going to turn it over now to Monica to bring us home.
Yes, Zannie, Jill, Rebecca, Ted, our chat and Q&A feature has been buzzing with comments and thoughts, and many of you articulated some of the answers to some of the questions that we received. For our audience, before you head out to that next thing on your calendar, I want to remind you that we did record today's session, and we will share our slide deck. And what we'll do is make that slide deck a little bit richer in information. We're going to put some recommendations that you've heard today and provide that to you in a follow-up email. We'll be sure to include some of the links that we shared in today's presentation, along with information about our refreshed data. That information is now live on our website, and we do hope that you're able to explore it, use it, and talk with it through your staff and your funders and your boards. We want that information to be available for you to have insightful change and conversations at your organization. I want to follow up and finish by saying another thank you to our amazing panelists, Jill, Ted, Rebecca. This was a wonderful session, and I'm so inspired by some of the conversation and thoughts that are happening in our chat. So this was wonderful, and thank you so much. Again, we're going to close our webinar time. I think we are officially almost at that hour space. Thank you, Zannie, for leading us through a wonderful walkthrough of the refreshed data. Thank you to our panelists. And again, thank you to our amazing audience. We had a lot of folks register for today's session, which was so exciting, but also grounding to us as we came to this conversation. So thank you to each of you for joining. Thank you for your questions. We'll try our best to try to round those up and provide some insights if we can. But thank you again for joining us. We really do appreciate your time today. And we do hope you stay connected with us at SMU DataArts, TRG Arts, Rebecca at Thomas and Associates, and Ted Russell Consulting. We hope you stay connected with all of us. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day.